Respected members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here to the chair and the chance to speak to the respected committee about the situation in the central Mediterranean Sea. I'm particularly honored and also saddened to hold my speech today in occasion of the 6th anniversary of the infamous shipwreck where more than 368 people died right in the front of Lampedusa as a result of an omission of rescue. 6 years have passed, and instead of trying to avoid similar tragedies, the EU member states have engaged in a policy of externalization of their responsibilities and a praxis of pushbacks and omissions of rescue, delegating interventions to a country at war, Libya, in breach of international law. And yet there is hope, represented by the European civil society at sea, defending the principle of human solidarity and respect for everyone's right to life and the rule of law. I have joined the civil effort at sea with Sea-Watch as an independent volunteer in 2016, when I decided to make available my experience as a captain. In my first mission, we rescued hundreds of lives and we intervened on a terrible shipwreck where also EU military vessels were involved. I remember our ship being surrounded by floating bodies. Some people died, hugging each other, and their corpses looked as inseparable. Martin, one of our volunteers, father of 3 children, recovered the body of a toddler. It was as if he couldn't accept that there was no life left in that little corpse. He kept singing to the baby and cradled him as if he was alive. We remained until dawn, collecting bodies with the Italian warship Nave Vega. It was alienating to use the life vests to mark the corpses, by tying them to a hand or foot, to not let them sink before the rescuers could recover them. I also took part in Sea-Watch aerial monitoring missions, and I witnessed multiple times people being left alone at sea or being forcibly returned to Libya, the country they had just escaped from. Yet none of these experiences has been as disruptive and frustrating as being stuck on the Sea-Watch 3 for 17 days, having to explain to the survivors we had rescued that the country in peace did not want them, that Europe, the so-called nest of human rights and civil liberties, did not consider them worth to touch its land. It was hard to be a European citizen in those days. It felt very shameful. Despite the eyes of European people, institutions and media were pointed at the Sea-Watch 3 and at me. I was alone with my crew and the people I had rescued, facing an imaginary wall built by the governments brick after brick in the middle of the sea, where no boundaries are physically possible. The Sea-Watch case put once again the EU against its own shame. The unwillingness of the member states to face a structural phenomenon of our times, the inability to agree on the redistribution of 53 people, which eventually forced me to enter the port of Lampedusa alone. I was received as if I was driving a ship carrying the pest, rather than a humanitarian ship with vulnerable and exhausted people on board. According to the security law, the Sea-Watch 3 carrying 53 rescuees was considered to be a threat to national security and public order. I received a lot of unwanted attention, invitations and awards by various European countries and institutions after entering the harbour. But where were you when we were asking for help through all possible operational, legal, media and diplomatic channels? Where were you when the only answer I got to the request of a safe place for disembarkation was Tripoli, the capital of a country at war where people would face systematic human rights abuses? After 17 days, I had to enter, not as an act of provocation, as it was depicted by many, but rather as an act of necessity and responsibility. towards everyone I had on board, and towards myself. I hadn't slept in days, nor had the crew. Then I was notified to be under criminal investigation, and I hoped that at least that would have led to the end of that incredible situation. And yet nothing. I did not feel it was safe anymore to further bear the responsibility towards everyone on board. Already for 2 nights, we had to organize extra shifts on deck to avoid desperate acts, which we had called suicide watches. The subtle, delicate, and yet fundamental bond between the guests and the crew was loosening. The trust was starting to leave the floor to desperation. I feared what could have happened, and I knew that as a captain, I had the duty to bring them to safety, and that was long overdue. I tried to do so, requesting the support of the authorities continuously for 17 days, and eventually I had to do it alone. I was legally responsible for the life of others as a captain, but before that, I was responsible as a human being. The situation could have been solved much earlier. The day following the rescue, a municipality within the network of over 60 solidarity cities in Germany had offered to receive our rescuees. This shows that welcoming is possible. Our case, as well as the ones of other NGOs, calls loudly for shared responsibility at EU level. Disembarkation of rescued people needs to happen in compliance with the law and cannot hence be conditional to ad hoc negotiations based on the will of individual member states and motivated each time by unknown interests, hence not reliable nor sustainable. We need a system change. A temporary relocation agreement with a focus on returning rather than welcoming misses human rights-based criteria for relocation. Applicable only to people rescued by NGOs, leaving out merchant vessels and not recognizing the central role of municipalities. It's not a realistic short-term solution. We shall ensure people's right to seek asylum through prompt relocation from ports of disembarkation, along with the creation of humanitarian corridors from Libya. A reform of the Dublin regulation is long overdue and shall be the focus for the weeks to come. However, the best way to ensure that people can access fair asylum procedures remains the creation of legal and safe routes to Europe. We do not only need a Dublin reform, we need safe passage. As we speak, I'm still under investigation, 2 criminal investigations in Italy for having saved lives in danger at sea. I'm not worried because my actions were justified by law and morality and as a human rights defender. The judge's decision on my arrest defined them as fulfillment of a duty. What worries me is that since then, the Sea-Watch 3 has been changed in port under a double criminal and administrative seizure. She has been recently freed from the prosecutor of Agrigento, and yet, as a consequence of the security law, she still cannot sail. In the moment, we observe a situation of daily omissions of rescue, a shameful bouncing of responsibility to the unaccountable Libyan authorities and of unjustifiable delays on interventions, while it is impossible to know how many cases remain unassisted. Last Sunday, we celebrated the Day of Migrants and Refugees, while a boat full of people has been left agonizing for 80 hours before being eventually returned to Libya, where they are facing further unnecessary suffering. The authorities were informed, but also this case will be protected by impunity. Conversely, every time an NGO vessel fulfills the duty to rescue anyone in need at sea, a criminal investigation is opened. Isn't this a distortion of justice? To punish civilians defending the rule of law and protecting an unlawful state practice. The central Mediterranean Sea is turning into a deserted cemetery, while the omission of rescue and pushbacks by proxy became an institutional practice, and the duty to rescue is criminalized. Thank you.
Thank you.